Babylon. What does that name evoke? The Tower of Babel from the Bible? Or two of the 7 wonders of the ancient world? Or how about the mysterious death of Alexander the Great in Babylon at age 32 in 323 BC? Babylon was famous for the Hanging Gardens, which no longer exist, unfortunately. They were supposedly created for the foreign wife of the Babylonian king, by some accounts Nebuchadnezzar, to remind her of her home in the mountains. They were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The other Babylonian wonder, which amazingly enough still exists, is its city walls and gates. The name Babylon means Gate of the Gods. The power and symbolism of Babylon may have waxed and waned during several millennia, but the name has always evoked a reaction, often respect and awe, but sometimes revulsion. Even now, its destruction and existence echo down to the 21st century, when U.S. troops were stationed on and unfortunately damaged its ancient grounds. In our last lecture, we looked at examples of Old Babylonian art, the period that dates to about 1800 BC. The Law Code of Hammurabi is the most celebrated work of that era. Hammurabi was the first king who brought Babylon to prominence as a center of religion and learning. Babylon's god was Marduk, a god who was associated with a distinctive and unusual creature, a snake dragon often called a mushushu. Marduk was the god of magic and wisdom, water and vegetation, and as the Babylonians rose to power, so did he, absorbing other gods and their properties in his wake. Babylon was conquered in the centuries succeeding Hammurabi by other groups. They included the Kassites and Neo-Assyrian kings. And it had a rather complicated history. It was only after the death of King Ashurbanipal of Assyria, the one famous for his lion hunt reliefs that we looked at, that Babylon rose to political ascendance and glory. King Nabopolassar, who reigned from 625 to 605 BC, restored the city to splendor. His son, Nebuchadnezzar, 604 to 562, created the fantastic gate and processional way which we are about to see. Nabopolassar launched the last great empire of Mesopotamia. We call it the Neo-Babylonian Empire. His son, Nebuchadnezzar, is well known from the Bible for his siege of Jerusalem, which first fell to him in 597 BC. Babylon possessed numerous examples of the glories of the ancient world. Herodotus had plenty to say about Babylon, and so did the Bible. In many references, the Bible used allegory and linked the city with evil. In fact, Babylon is probably the most mythologized and written about city in all of the ancient Near East. It has many associations, and not all of them are positive, like the Whore of Babylon referenced in the book of Revelation. However, the building projects of the Babylonian kings still remain among the greatest wonders of the ancient world. They combine spectacular, vivid color, grandeur, and defensive function in a gigantic undertaking, and we still have parts of them to admire, like the Ishtar Gate and Processional Way. The wall surrounding Babylon was thought to be immense. Herodotus reported that 4-horse chariots could drive on top of it. Really, the whole defensive wall and several gates of the city were indications not only of its great fortification against enemies, but also a symbol of its importance and greatness. Here's what Herodotus said when describing Babylon. The city stands on a broad plain and is an exact square. While such is its size, in magnificence there is no other city that approaches to it. It is surrounded in the first place by a broad and deep moat full of water, behind which rises a wall. The outer wall is the main defense of the city. There is, however, a second inner wall of less thickness than the first, but very little inferior to it in strength. The great height of the walls, their length, and their elaborate decoration and magnificent gates made the strongest impression on visitors. We're able to postulate the plan of Babylon from the descriptions of Herodotus and others. We know from excavations that there were, in fact, an outer and an inner wall, and that these were double walls, the outer one of baked brick and the inner one of sun-dried mud brick with rubble between them. Babylon might have looked something like this. Babylon was essentially a defensive walled city, like some we've seen before. Nineveh and even Uruk had walls to guard against invaders. But the size of the city, ruins extending to 750 hectares and 8 kilometers along just one wall, and its extraordinary double walls surpassed in sheer size, length, and beauty any that had come before. The walls had towers for observation at regular intervals and magnificent gates covered in bronze. The city plan was a little peculiar. It was divided in two by the Euphrates River, and the river and moats were controlled by an extensive system of gratings and canals. In King Nebuchadnezzar's own words, this is how he built it. In order to strengthen the defenses of Esagila, that the evil and wicked might not oppress Babylon, to the east I put about a great wall. Its moat I dug, and its inner moat wall with mortar and brick I raised mountain high, in order that no pillaging robber might enter this water sewer. With bright iron bars I closed the entrance to the river. In gratings of iron bars I set it, and fastened it with hinges. The defenses of Esagila and Babylon I strengthened, and secured for my reign an enduring name. Esagila was the name of the temple of Marduk, and the Tower of Babel was Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Marduk, the city's god. Both temples were near the wall fronting on the Euphrates. In his accounts, Herodotus seems to exaggerate a bit about the actual length and size of the city, so we don't know whether he actually visited Babylon. He also most scandalously claimed that Babylonians had a cult of sacred prostitution. The cult, he wrote, required every woman of the city to go once to the temple of Aphrodite, Ishtar, really. She would then wait for strangers to throw a coin in her lap in order to have sexual relations and fulfill her duty to the goddess. Such a custom is unlikely and hasn't been confirmed by any real evidence. But it certainly gave Babylon a reputation for licentiousness. Most scholars think it's a highly imaginative version of the rites surrounding the cult of Ishtar in Babylon. Priestesses may have been the ones who carried on this custom, not the general population. One of Babylon's main religious festivals was the New Year ceremony, celebrated at the spring equinox and the barley harvest. It was called Akitu and centered on the cult of Marduk, the city god, although all the gods attended, or at least their statues did. These Akitu rites involved a sacred procession bearing the images of the gods through the city and its gates to a temple outside the city called a Bit Akitu. The New Year's rites also involved the humiliation of the king before Marduk. He was slapped and briefly stripped of his insignia of office. This reminded the king of his dependence upon the good graces of the god Marduk. The purpose of the ceremony was to keep the ruler humble and pious and to please Marduk with the king's tears. It was a moment of atonement for sins, an acknowledgement of the great power of Marduk for the whole city. The processional way and the gates of Babylon were built with such splendor and grandeur to accommodate this extremely important New Year's procession. It was, after all, the assembly of the gods that they were celebrating, so it had to be spectacular. And the Ishtar gate, through which the New Year ceremony proceeded, was the main gate and the most spectacular of all the 8 or so gates. This Ishtar gate and the processional way are both hugely impressive works of architecture and engineering in terms of sheer size and effort. But it's the overall impression of towering walls and gates with bright colors and relief sculpture made of glazed bricks that raises it to the level of an artistic masterpiece. Glazed bricks had not been used to this extent before, and in fact, glazing was unknown in Mesopotamia until this era. The actual gate was a double one, made of baked mud brick and perhaps 12 meters or 40 feet high, according to some scholars. Or it could have been much higher, according to others. 120 striding lions marched with you on the processional way towards the Ishtar gate. They were in relief, made of molded and glazed brick and brightly colored. Babylon was excavated by the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey in 1900 to 1917. He removed great portions of the Ishtar gate and processional way, particularly the glazed brick part that was meant to be the most impressive. And they were carted off to Berlin. That is why today, if you go to the Pergamon Museum, you will see a reconstruction of the Ishtar gate and the processional way, which incorporates the actual bricks. This gate is now one of the great treasures of Berlin. Not only Berlin got part of the spoils. Museums around the world were interested in having a piece of the processional way or gate and got them from Berlin in the 1930s. Today, you can find glazed brick images of the Lion of Ishtar or the Mushushu from Babylon in museums like the Metropolitan in New York, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and so forth. These are the real thing, and the reconstruction of the actual Babylon has proceeded with new baked bricks. Saddam Hussein tried to reconstruct Babylon, putting his name on the bricks in the custom of the Neo-Babylonian kings. This was all meant to link him with the glories of the past, particularly with King Nebuchadnezzar, and was an interesting form of nationalistic fervor and megalomania. What does the composition of the Ishtar gate and the processional way have to tell us today? What significance did the different animals have for the Babylonians? Let's take a closer look. Each of these individual lions from the processional way is about 1.05 meters high. These were the lions of Ishtar. They are male, striding beasts whose mouths are open and whose teeth look formidable. They seem like they're roaring or snarling. In Babylonian, the name of the street along which they marched was Aibur Shabu, the enemy shall never pass. So the hostile demeanor of the lions was intentional and an intimidating deterrent to attacks. The lions were mass-produced, composed of scores of molded bricks. Multiple bricks had been created from many individual molds for each different part of the lion. These were fired. These were then glazed in appropriate colors and fired again. The background bricks were all in intense lapis blue. The body of the lion was white, and the manes were yellow or red, although some have faded to green. The belly of each beast is partly covered by the mane's reddish or yellowish hair. The lion's long tail, with a tuft at the end, curves elegantly, echoing the lion's back leg. Making these bricks and then fitting them together must have been like putting together a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. This was an elaborate and arduous process, but the result was spectacular. Each of the processional way lions strides as if to encourage the forward march of the people alongside it. They have magnificent colors. The lions are robustly modeled, and their muscular bodies exude power and strength. The lion, of course, was a symbol of the goddess of love and war, Ishtar. And as you may recall, the old Babylonian Queen of the Night plaque showed the image of a goddess, quite possibly Ishtar, standing on her two lions. Here in Babylon, the lions are divorced from any actual image of Ishtar, and it seems their purpose was twofold. One was to invoke the presence of the warlike Ishtar. The other was probably to invoke the ferocity and strength of the lion itself in protecting the city. Let's talk about that trait of real lions for a moment. Male lions, we know, are extremely territorial. The male roars at night, at dawn, and at dusk. He lets others know he is in control of his territory, warning them. He's letting others know he will fight to defend his ground and his pride. Females are no slouches either in defending their pride or their young, but they don't roar as resonantly as the males. If you have ever heard a real lion roar, you know how extremely frightening and loud they can be. I certainly have never been more terrified than the first night I spent in the bush in Kenya. I was trying to sleep in a tent, and lions bellowed loudly outside for hours, it seemed, and needless to say, I didn't sleep that much. The bellowing, resonating roar can be heard for about 8 kilometers or 5 miles. The sound is so intense and so low that it must have been understood by anyone anywhere near a roaring lion. It says that they should stay away. Roaring was also associated with thunder of the gods in many cultures. Male lions also fight each other over possession of a pride, and their battles are impressive. Their manes, in fact, make them seem larger than they really are, which is helpful in a confrontation. So when males fight each other, the mane and the roar are meant to be intimidating. The lions of Babylon, in brick on the walls, are intended to get the same message across. Do not cross me. I will defend and stand my ground. I will protect my territory. And that's the crux of the reason that you will see so many lion gates used in the ancient world. The gates are meant to guard and protect the city. They are then each overlaid with myth. Here are just 2 gates that date to before our lions of Babylon. The famous Lion Gate at Bogazkoy, Turkey, a gate to the capital city of the Hittites, circa 1400 BC, and the later Lion Gate from Mycenae in Greece, circa 1300 BC. You'll note that the earlier Hittite gate has 2 male lions roaring from flanking gates. The Mycenaean gate has 2 lionesses at the top. Both male and female lions are brave, intimidating, and glorious to see. These lions, then, are also appropriate for the depiction of kingly power and the might of an empire. The lion's meaning and use here is quite different from that of the Assyrian lion hunts. The Assyrian king was seeking to make a statement about keeping the wild at bay by killing lions and protecting his populace. The lion depictions on the wall, then, serve to intimidate enemies or allies, glorify the ruler, invoke the warlike aspect of the goddess Ishtar, and also to move the procession visually towards its gate. Imagine we are walking along the processional way with a crowd of priests and people carrying sacred images. We're about to celebrate the Akitu, or New Year's festival. We're marching towards the New Year's temple alongside the lions until we face the grandest gate of the city, the Ishtar gate. What do we see? According to Nebuchadnezzar, he put in place mighty bronze colossi of bulls and dragons to guard the gate. They're long gone, but the gate still exists. The gate is a double one. There are also two huge towers that flank it. It's entirely composed of baked glazed brick. Under the latest gate are remains of earlier unglazed gates, just like it. As we look at the Ishtar gate, we see images of two other creatures repeated over and over. We also see a series of rosettes lining the bottom of the gate and the archway itself. They also line the processional way. These are the same rosettes we saw from 2,000 years earlier in the ram in a thicket. They represent Ishtar. So we have a visual reminder of the presence of the goddess with a pattern that evokes her and is wonderfully decorative. The sheer size of the gate was enough to awe you. In the Berlin Museum, the reconstructed gate is 14.3 meters high, but the original gate was probably much higher, maybe 23 meters. The animals on the gate are striking in their repetition and their movement. First of all, we have bulls, and they're known as the animal of the weather and storm god, Adad. Lightning is an attribute of Adad, and the thundering hooves of the bull were likened to it. Thunderclouds were actually called the bull calves of the storm god, Adad. Bulls were important symbols that were used for thousands of years in Mesopotamia. The wild bull symbolized male vigor and potency, the king, and the storm god. And the bull lent its horns, of course, as the ultimate symbol of divinity. Usually the kind of bull Mesopotamians used in art is thought to be the wild aurochs, much larger and fiercer than domesticated cattle. It had lyre-shaped horns that projected forward. Aurochs became extinct in the 17th century AD, but it's thought that they gave rise to our domestic cattle. You can see that the bulls depicted on the gate are strong and well-muscled. They stride forward with horns frontward and head slightly lower, almost as if alert and ready to charge. While the entire background of the gate is the same brilliant blue as the processional way, the bull is yellow with flowing bluish mane that continues in a stripe down its back. It has a determined stride, just like the lion. The last animal we're going to look at here on the gate is the snake dragon, or Mushushu, as it was called. This was the symbol of the chief Babylonian god Marduk. Mushushu was actually a very ancient name. It's Akkadian and it means furious snake. This strange animal was known for at least 2,000 years before it appears here on the gates of Babylon, identified with Marduk. The snake dragon is a very interesting beast. It's a composite of all the really dangerous and scary parts of other important animals. A horned viper with scales, forelegs of a lion, rear legs of a raptorial bird, talons with scales, and sometimes even a scorpion tail. It was meant to be magically protective. It used all its most powerful and dangerous qualities in favor of the population it protects, in this case, Babylon. Let's look closely at the snake. I wrote my dissertation on serpent imagery, so this subject always gets me wound up. I believe you need to go back to the original animal in nature, observe it, and see its behavior to understand it in the context of the art. The serpent head we see on the Mushushu, for example, seems to belong to a species we call Cerastes cornutus. That's a venomous horned viper found in Mesopotamia and thereabouts even today. It's a nasty viper, a sidewinder, and we find it represented in ancient Near Eastern pottery and seals as early as 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The horns, we know, represent divinity when they are on the heads of Mesopotamian gods. This particular creature, as a horned snake, must have struck a chord with the earliest inhabitants of the ancient Near East. The body of our Ishtar gate dragon is long and scaly like a snake, and the tail twists a bit as it rises up. It often had the sting of a scorpion at the end, although that's not clear in the gate's depictions. The feet, however, are clear. You can see the lion's feet and talons quite unmistakably. What a frightening beast, and it has all the most potent aspects of those creatures represented. Though it also represents the god Marduk here, the dragon or furious snake, as it was translated, served what we call an apotropaic function. That is, it warded off evil by being so intimidating. Mesopotamians, as well as other cultures, really liked to harness the power of dangerous or evil-seeming creatures for their own benefit. They believed this would happen if they represented them and prayed to them. This use of the snake dragon here is meant to be seen precisely this way. It repelled evil and symbolized the strength of the city's own god, Marduk. Also, it didn't hurt that the enemies of Babylon would be frightened by these images and the notion that the gods of Babylon were powerful creatures. What I find interesting about these animal images, and I hope you see this as well, is that the quick transmission of animal symbols like these takes place all over the world. It was much easier to transmit an image and its power than to translate writings of another language. The visual power of a bull or a lion has a universal impact. Yet we also find that the animal symbols have meanings that get very culture-specific. For instance, the snake in Mesopotamia is frequently seen as a symbol of rejuvenation and rebirth, probably because the shedding of its skin gives that impression. And the serpent was immortalized as the bringer of youth in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But in the Old Testament, of course, the snake gets a reputation for evil that is unparalleled. And similarly, snakes in popular culture today are almost invariably associated with horror and evil. We'll see how bulls and lions figure very importantly in the next culture we look at, in Persia, Iran. The Persian or Achaemenid Empire was the one which had conquered the Babylonians. Cyrus the Great, the founder and the ruler of the Persian Empire, conquered Babylon in 539 BC. According to Herodotus, who recounts the fall of Babylon as unopposed, the clever Persians surprised the city by diverting the Euphrates away from Babylon. They then entered the city. How? By means of the city's dry riverbed, which rendered all of the defensive bulwarks and preparations useless. Cyrus entered Babylon in triumph, while the populace was celebrating the New Year's festival. Cyrus then took power from the erratic Babylonian king, Nabonidus, and declared himself ruler of Babylon. The Persians had sacked Nineveh in 612 BC, so both the Assyrian and Babylonian empires were no longer under native rule. Alexander the Great continued this trend by conquering the Persians. But he died young of a fever at age 32 in Babylon in 323 BC. And perhaps it was malaria. In any case, Alexander's attempts to restore Babylon to greatness ended with his death. The art, however, lived on. Interestingly, as we'll see, the sites encountered by the Achaemenid Persians at Nineveh and Babylon spurred them on to greater heights in art and architecture. The Persians were determined to outdo the artistic splendors of Mesopotamia, so they established their own grander cities and palaces. The most spectacular example of Achaemenid art is at the site of Persepolis. At Persepolis, which we'll examine next, we'll see the hand and the influence of the Babylonian and Assyrian artists and even Greeks wrought larger than life. The gigantic sculptures and works of the Persian Empire are testimony to this. the combined influences of all the great artistic traditions which came before them in the ancient Near East.